In the grand halls of Ravencrest Palace, where centuries of tradition echo through marble corridors, a modern battle for influence was brewing. What appeared to be polite smiles and gracious curtsies in public masked a calculated war between two of the most powerful women in the kingdom. When Queen Consort Victoria Ashford set her sights on dismantling Princess Elena's rising popularity, she underestimated one crucial factor: the fierce loyalty of Prince Alexander, heir to the throne, who would stop at nothing to protect the woman he loved. This is the untold story of palace intrigue, family betrayal, and the moment when royal protocol shattered under the weight of personal vendettas. Princess Elena Rosewood had never imagined that marrying Prince Alexander would make her a target in her own home. Standing before the ornate mirror in her private chambers, she adjusted the sapphire necklace that had belonged to Alexander's late mother, Queen Isabella. The weight of the jewels felt heavier today, not because of their size, but because of what they represented: a connection to the royal family that some believed she didn't deserve. 3 years had passed since their fairy tale wedding, broadcast to millions around the world. Elena, a successful environmental lawyer from a middle-class family, had captured the heart of the kingdom's most eligible bachelor. Their love story had been genuine, built on shared values and mutual respect. But fairy tales, Elena was learning, had a way of turning dark once the camera stopped rolling. Queen Consort Victoria Ashford, who had married King Edmund 5 years after Queen Isabella's tragic death, had initially welcomed Elena with open arms. The public had praised Victoria's grace in accepting her stepson's choice of bride. Behind palace walls, however, a different story was unfolding. Victoria had spent years carefully crafting her image as the perfect royal consort, slowly but surely cementing her position and influence within the monarchy. Elena's natural charisma and growing popularity with the public had begun to overshadow Victoria's carefully orchestrated public appearances. When Elena launched her environmental initiative, Green Crown, it received unprecedented support from citizens and international organizations alike. Environmental leaders praised her authentic commitment to climate change, noting how she used her platform to create real change rather than mere photo opportunities. The breaking point came during a state dinner honoring the Prime Minister of Denmark. Elena had been discussing renewable energy projects with several world leaders when she noticed Victoria approaching with a particularly cold smile. What happened next would later be described by palace staff as the moment when the gloves truly came off. "Elena, darling," Victoria had said, her voice carrying across the ornate dining room just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Perhaps you should leave the serious political discussions to those of us with more experience in international affairs. Your little environmental hobby is admirable, but tonight is about real diplomacy." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She had spent months preparing for this dinner, studying briefing materials and consulting with experts to ensure she could contribute meaningfully to conversations about global cooperation on climate initiatives. To have her work dismissed as a hobby in front of distinguished guests was both humiliating and revealing of Victoria's true feelings. Prince Alexander, who had been speaking with the Danish ambassador across the room, noticed the sudden tension immediately. He had developed an acute awareness of his stepmother's passive-aggressive tactics over the years, but seeing them directed at Elena ignited something protective and fierce within him. He excused himself from his conversation and moved smoothly across the room, placing a supportive hand on Elena's shoulder. "Actually, Victoria," Alexander said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of his royal position, "Elena's environmental work has already resulted in 3 major international partnerships and a commitment from 12 nations to adopt our sustainable practices model. I'd hardly call influencing global policy a hobby." The momentary flash of anger in Victoria's eyes was quickly replaced by her practiced royal smile, but the damage was done. Several guests had witnessed the exchange, and Elena could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. What should have been a triumph, her first major state dinner as a senior royal, had become a battlefield. Later that evening, Elena found herself walking through the palace gardens, seeking solace among the rose bushes that Queen Isabella had planted decades earlier. The scent of jasmine filled the night air, and for a moment she could almost imagine what it would have been like to have Alexander's mother as her guide through the complexities of royal life. "She would have loved you," came Alexander's voice from behind her. He had found her as he always did, seeming to sense when she needed him most. "My mother would have been so proud to see what you've accomplished." Elena turned to face her husband, this man who had chosen to love her despite the complications it brought to his life. In the moonlight, she could see the resemblance to his father, but his eyes held a warmth and determination that was entirely his own. "I don't understand why Victoria sees me as such a threat," Elena admitted. "I've never tried to compete with her or undermine her position." Alexander took her hands in his, feeling the slight tremor that revealed how deeply the evening's encounter had affected her. "That's exactly why she sees you as a threat," he explained gently. "You don't have to try to outshine her. You do it naturally. Your authenticity, your genuine care for others, your intelligence. These aren't things that can be taught or faked." Victoria has spent years building a carefully constructed image, and your very presence highlights the difference between performance and authenticity. The conversation was interrupted by the soft footsteps of Lady Margaret Thornton, Elena's lady-in-waiting, and one of the few palace staff members she considered a true friend. Margaret's usually composed expression showed signs of distress as she approached them in the garden. "Your Royal Highnesses, forgive the intrusion," Margaret began, her voice tight with concern. "But I felt you should know immediately. There are already whispers among the staff about this evening's dinner. Some are saying that the princess was publicly corrected for overstepping her bounds." Elena felt her heart sink. In the palace, gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and once a narrative took hold among the staff, it had a way of reaching the press and the public. The idea that she had been corrected for trying to participate in meaningful conversation was exactly the kind of story that could undermine months of careful relationship building with the public and international partners. Alexander's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. He had witnessed his stepmother's manipulation tactics before, but this was different. This was a calculated attempt to damage Elena's reputation and, by extension, her ability to fulfill her royal duties effectively. The timing was particularly cruel, coming just as Elena was finding her footing and beginning to make a real impact through her charitable work. "Margaret," Alexander said, his voice taking on the commanding tone he typically reserved for official business, "I want you to quietly speak with the senior staff. Make it clear that anyone spreading gossip about this evening's events will face immediate consequences." The princess was engaging in exactly the kind of diplomatic conversation that we should expect from a senior member of the royal family. As Margaret nodded and discreetly withdrew, Elena realized that this was more than just an uncomfortable family dynamic. Victoria's actions tonight had been a declaration of war, carefully calculated to humiliate Elena in front of influential witnesses while maintaining plausible deniability. If anyone questioned her behavior, she could claim she was simply offering friendly guidance to her daughter-in-law. The next morning brought confirmation that Victoria's strategy was working exactly as planned. Elena's private secretary, James Whitmore, brought her the morning briefings with an unusually grave expression. The society pages were already running subtle but damaging stories about tension at the state dinner, with unnamed sources suggesting that the younger generation of royals might need more guidance in handling serious diplomatic situations. "The angle they're taking is particularly insidious," James explained as Elena reviewed the coverage. "They're not directly criticizing you, but they're questioning your readiness for certain royal duties. It plants doubt without making any specific accusations that we could directly refute." Elena recognized the sophistication of the attack. Victoria had spent years observing how the press operated, learning exactly how to feed them stories that would damage her targets while keeping her own hands seemingly clean. The suggestion that Elena needed guidance was particularly clever. It positioned Victoria as the wise mentor and Elena as the inexperienced student who had overreached. The impact on Elena's scheduled activities became apparent almost immediately. A planned meeting with environmental ministers from 3 European nations was quietly postponed, with their representatives citing scheduling conflicts. Elena knew better. Someone had suggested that she might not be the appropriate royal representative for such important discussions. Prince Alexander's response was swift and decisive. Within hours of reading the morning coverage, he had scheduled an emergency meeting with his father, King Edmund. The conversation that followed would set the stage for everything that came next, as Alexander prepared to defend his wife against an attack that threatened not just her reputation, but the very foundation of their marriage and their future roles in the monarchy. As Elena prepared for what she knew would be the fight of her life, she drew strength from the memory of Queen Isabella's journal, which Alexander had shared with her shortly after their engagement. In it, the late queen had written about the challenges of royal life. A crown is not just a symbol of power, it's a test of character. Those who wear it with authenticity and grace will always face opposition from those who see it merely as an accessory to be displayed. The battle lines have been drawn, and Elena was about to discover just how far Queen Consort Victoria was willing to go to protect her position, and how far Prince Alexander would go to protect the woman he loved. Part 2. King Edmund sat behind the massive oak desk that had served 6 generations of monarchs, his weathered hands folded as he listened to his son's carefully controlled account of the previous evening's events. The morning light, streaming through the tall windows of his private study, illuminated the tension lines that had become more pronounced since Victoria's integration into the royal family. At 68, the king had seen enough palace intrigue to recognize a power struggle when it emerged, but this situation was particularly delicate because it involved his wife and heir. "Father," Alexander continued, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "What happened last night wasn't a simple misunderstanding or social awkwardness. It was a calculated attempt to undermine Elena's credibility in front of international dignitaries. The timing, the audience, the specific words chosen, everything was deliberate." The king's silence stretched long enough that Alexander began to wonder if his father was choosing sides. Edmund had always been a man who valued stability above all else, having taken the throne during a period of constitutional crisis when he was barely 30. The idea of confronting his wife about her behavior toward his daughter-in-law clearly made him uncomfortable. "Victoria has been instrumental in restoring dignity to the crown after your mother's death," the king finally said, his tone measured but revealing. "The transition could have been much more difficult without her guidance and experience. Perhaps there's a way to address this situation without creating unnecessary conflict." Alexander felt a flash of frustration at his father's diplomatic response. He had hoped for immediate support, but instead was getting the kind of careful political calculation that prioritized institutional stability over individual justice. "Father, with respect, Elena's reputation and effectiveness as a senior royal are being systematically undermined. If we don't address this now, it will only get worse. Victoria is testing boundaries, and our response will determine how far she's willing to push." Before the king could respond, a soft knock interrupted their conversation. Victoria herself entered, as if summoned by their discussion of her. She was impeccably dressed, as always, her silver hair styled in the elegant chignon that had become her signature look. Her smile was warm and seemed genuine, but Alexander had learned to recognize the calculation behind his stepmother's expressions. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Victoria said, settling gracefully into the chair beside Alexander's without waiting for an invitation. "I wanted to discuss last night's dinner with both of you. I'm concerned that there may have been some misunderstanding about my interaction with Elena." The audacity of her preemptive strike impressed Alexander, even as it infuriated him. By framing the conversation as a concern about misunderstanding, she was positioning herself as the reasonable party seeking to clear the air, while implicitly suggesting that Elena had misinterpreted an innocent comment. "Victoria," the king began, clearly hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated, "Alexander has expressed some concerns about Elena's experience last evening. Perhaps you could help us understand what happened from your perspective." Victoria's expression shifted to one of maternal concern, the look she had perfected during her years of charitable work before marrying into the royal family. Of course, Edmund. I was simply trying to guide Elena through what could be a challenging aspect of royal duty, engaging with world leaders on complex policy matters. She's wonderfully passionate about environmental issues, but passion without experience can sometimes lead to awkward situations. The carefully chosen words were masterful in their cruelty. By acknowledging Elena's passion while questioning her experience, Victoria was undermining her daughter-in-law's credibility while appearing supportive. The suggestion of awkward situations implied that Elena had somehow embarrassed herself or the royal family, despite the fact that her conversations with the international guests had been both informed and well-received. Alexander felt his patience evaporating. Elena wasn't creating awkward situations, Victoria. She was successfully engaging world leaders on issues where she has both expertise and genuine achievements. The Danish ambassador specifically mentioned to me how impressed he was with her knowledge of sustainable development policies. "Oh, I'm sure he was being polite," Victoria replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "World leaders are always gracious when speaking to members of our family. But privately, I've heard concerns from some of our diplomatic staff about ensuring that our international partnerships aren't complicated by enthusiastic but perhaps premature policy discussions." The implication was clear. Victoria had been building a case against Elena behind the scenes, gathering support from diplomatic staff who would naturally be cautious about any royal family member who might inadvertently create complications in international relations. It was a sophisticated political maneuver that put Elena in an impossible position. The more passionately she defended her work, the more she might appear to prove Victoria's point about being enthusiastic but premature. King Edmund shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing the impossible situation he was being placed in. Supporting his son and daughter-in-law would mean confronting his wife and potentially destabilizing their marriage. Supporting Victoria would mean sacrificing Elena's reputation and, by extension, damaging his relationship with Alexander. Perhaps, the king suggested carefully, there's a way to provide Elena with additional support and guidance as she continues to develop her royal duties. Victoria, your experience could be invaluable in helping her navigate the more complex aspects of international diplomacy. Alexander realized with growing alarm that his father was essentially agreeing to put Elena under Victoria's supervision, giving his stepmother exactly what she wanted: official authority over Elena's activities and the ability to control her access to important royal duties. It was a solution that appeared reasonable on the surface, but would effectively neuter Elena's independence and potential impact. "That's a thoughtful suggestion, Edmund," Victoria said, her satisfaction barely concealed. "I'd be happy to work more closely with Elena to ensure she feels confident and prepared for these challenging situations. We could start by reviewing her upcoming engagements to make sure she's properly briefed on the protocols and potential sensitivities involved." The meeting concluded with what appeared to be a diplomatic solution, but felt to Alexander like a complete capitulation to Victoria's manipulation. As they left his father's study, Alexander realized that the battle for Elena's position in the royal family was far from over. It was escalating to a new level. That afternoon, Elena was summoned to Victoria's private sitting room for what was described as a collaborative planning session for her upcoming environmental summit. The room was decorated in Victoria's preferred style, formal, traditional, and designed to remind visitors of the established hierarchy. Elena arrived punctually, determined to maintain her professionalism despite the morning's developments. "Elena, dear, please sit," Victoria said, gesturing to a chair positioned slightly lower than her own, a subtle but clear power dynamic. "I've been reviewing your plans for next month's summit, and I'm afraid there are several concerns we need to address." Elena felt her heart sink as Victoria opened a thick folder filled with what appeared to be detailed critiques of every aspect of the environmental summit Elena had spent months organizing. The event was scheduled to bring together environmental ministers, business leaders, and activists from across Europe to discuss concrete steps toward carbon neutrality, exactly the kind of meaningful initiative that would demonstrate the royal family's commitment to addressing global challenges. The guest list is quite ambitious, Victoria continued, her tone suggesting this was a problem rather than an achievement. I'm not sure it's wise to have so many activists and environmental protesters in close proximity to senior government ministers. The potential for uncomfortable confrontations could reflect poorly on the crown. Elena had spent weeks carefully vetting the guest list to ensure productive dialogue between different stakeholders. The suggestion that environmental advocates were simply protesters revealed both Victoria's bias and her strategy. Frame Elena's work as potentially embarrassing to the royal family rather than as a meaningful contribution to important global issues. The activists I've invited are respected leaders in their fields, Elena explained calmly. Dr. Sarah Chun from the International Climate Institute, Professor Miguel Rodriguez from the Sustainable Development Council. These aren't protesters, they're experts whose research and advocacy have influenced policy at the highest levels. Victoria's smile remained fixed, but Elena could see the flash of annoyance at having her characterization corrected. Of course, dear, I'm sure they're all very accomplished, but we must consider how their presence might be perceived by the more traditional elements of our government and international partners. Perhaps a more refined guest list would be appropriate for your first major summit as a senior royal. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Victoria systematically undermining each aspect of Elena's carefully planned summit. The venue was too informal, the agenda was too ambitious, the timeline was too rushed. Each criticism was delivered with apparent concern for Elena's success, but the cumulative effect was to make the summit seem like a dangerous mistake that could embarrass both Elena and the royal family. Elena left the meeting feeling demoralized and confused. Victoria's criticisms weren't entirely without merit. Royal events did require careful consideration of protocol and potential political sensitivities. But the systematic nature of the critique, combined with alternative suggestions that would essentially turn the summit into a traditional ceremonial event with little substantive content, made it clear that Victoria's goal was control rather than improvement. That evening, Alexander found Elena in their private library, surrounded by the summit planning documents she had been revising based on Victoria's suggestions. The changes had transformed her ambitious environmental conference into something that looked more like a traditional royal garden party with environmental decorations. "She's trying to make me into a different person," Elena said without looking up from the papers. "Every suggestion she makes pushes me further away from the work I actually care about, and toward becoming some kind of ceremonial figurehead who cuts ribbons and makes small talk." Alexander sat beside her, studying the revised plans that bore little resemblance to the innovative conference Elena had originally envisioned. "She's not trying to make you into a different person," he said quietly. "She's trying to make you disappear entirely, to turn you into a version of herself that poses no threat to her position or influence." The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Understanding Victoria's strategy provided clarity about what they were facing, but it also made clear how high the stakes really were. This wasn't just about a single summit or even Elena's specific royal duties. It was about whether Elena would be allowed to have any meaningful impact as a member of the royal family, or whether she would be slowly marginalized until she became irrelevant. As Alexander looked at his wife, surrounded by the diminished remains of her ambitious plans, he made a decision that would change everything. The careful diplomacy and institutional loyalty that had been drummed into him since childhood was no longer enough. If the traditional channels wouldn't protect Elena, he would find other ways to ensure that her voice was heard and her contributions were valued. The war between Victoria and Elena was about to take a dramatic turn, as Prince Alexander prepared to use every resource at his disposal to protect the woman he loved, even if it meant challenging the very foundations of the royal hierarchy he had been raised to preserve. Part 3 the following morning brought news that would accelerate the conflict beyond anyone's expectations. Elena's private secretary, James, arrived at her breakfast meeting with an expression of barely controlled excitement mixed with concern. In his hands was a leaked internal memo from the European Environmental Council that would change everything. "Your Royal Highness," James began, his voice tight with the implications of what he was about to share, "the Council has unanimously voted to offer you the position of honorary chair for their new Global Climate Initiative. This would make you the youngest royal in history to hold such a significant international environmental position." Elena felt her breath catch. The European Environmental Council represented 37 nations and wielded enormous influence over international climate policy. Their offer wasn't just an honor. It was recognition of her genuine expertise and a platform that could amplify her environmental work across continents. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had dreamed of when she first began using her royal platform for meaningful change. But James's expression suggested there were complications. "The offer comes with a significant requirement," he continued. "The position would involve leading a major climate summit in Geneva next spring, hosting international delegations, and presenting the Council's recommendations directly to the United Nations General Assembly. The level of independence and authority would be unprecedented for a junior member of any royal family." Elena understood immediately why James looked concerned. The offer was magnificent, but accepting it would put her in direct conflict with Victoria's campaign to limit her influence. Leading an international environmental initiative would make Elena one of the most visible and independent royal figures in Europe, exactly the kind of prominence that threatened Victoria's carefully maintained position as the family's primary female leader. Before Elena could fully process the implications, Alexander appeared in the doorway with his own piece of concerning news. His expression was grim, and Elena could see the controlled anger that indicated something significant had happened. "Victoria has called an emergency meeting of the Royal Council for this afternoon," Alexander announced, settling into the chair beside Elena. "The official agenda is to discuss appropriate protocols for junior family members engaging in international activities. The timing suggests she's heard about the Environmental Council offer." Elena felt the pieces clicking into place with disturbing clarity. Victoria's network of contacts within the palace and diplomatic circles was more extensive than they had realized. Someone had informed her about the offer before Elena even had a chance to consider her response. The emergency Royal Council meeting was clearly designed to create official barriers that would make accepting the position either impossible or politically damaging. The Royal Council consisted of senior advisors, constitutional experts, and family members who provided guidance on matters affecting the monarchy's public role. In theory, it was a supportive institution designed to help royal family members navigate complex situations. In practice, as Elena was about to discover, it could be weaponized to control and constrain individual members who stepped outside established boundaries. "She's going to argue that the position is inappropriate for someone in my position," Elena realized aloud. "That it would create conflicts with traditional royal neutrality, or that I lack the experience for such responsibility." Alexander's expression darkened further. "She's been building support among the council members for weeks. Lady Pemberton mentioned to me yesterday that Victoria had been asking detailed questions about the constitutional implications of royal family members taking leadership roles in international organizations. She's been preparing for this moment." The sophisticated nature of Victoria's strategy was becoming increasingly apparent. She hadn't just been reacting to Elena's growing influence. She had been systematically preparing to contain it. The timing of her public criticism at the state dinner, the subsequent meetings with diplomatic staff, and now the emergency council session represented a coordinated campaign to establish clear limits on Elena's activities. Elena spent the hours before the council meeting preparing her defense, researching precedents for royal involvement in international organizations, and consulting with constitutional experts who could support her position. But she also knew that facts and precedents would only matter if the council members were willing to hear them objectively. Victoria's influence over several key members made the outcome far from certain. The council chamber was an imposing room filled with centuries of royal portraits and formal furniture designed to emphasize tradition and hierarchy. As Elena entered, She could immediately sense the atmosphere. Several members avoided eye contact while others offered sympathetic but cautious smiles that suggested they had already heard Victoria's perspective on the situation. Victoria presided over the meeting with the practiced grace of someone completely confident in her position. She had dressed impeccably in deep blue, a color that conveyed both authority and trustworthiness, and her demeanor was that of a concerned family member seeking to protect both Elena and the monarchy from potential complications. "Thank you all for gathering on such short notice," Victoria began, her voice carrying just the right note of reluctant necessity. "We face a situation that requires careful consideration of both Elena's personal aspirations and our institutional responsibilities. The European Environmental Council has made an offer that, while flattering, raises significant questions about appropriate boundaries for junior royal family members." The way Victoria framed the issue was masterful. By describing the offer as flattering rather than prestigious or deserved, she diminished its significance. The reference to personal aspirations versus institutional responsibilities created a false dichotomy that positioned Elena's environmental work as self-serving rather than service-oriented. Lord Fairfax, one of the senior constitutional advisors and a longtime friend of Victoria's late first husband, spoke first. "Your Majesty raises important concerns about precedent. We must consider whether accepting such a prominent international position might compromise the neutrality that is essential to the Crown's effectiveness." Elena felt her stomach sink as she realized how thoroughly Victoria had prepared the ground. The neutrality argument was particularly insidious because it appeared to be about protecting important constitutional principles while actually serving to limit Elena's ability to make meaningful contributions to global issues. "With respect, Lord Fairfax," Elena responded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The position is focused on environmental science and policy implementation, not partisan politics. The Crown has a long history of supporting scientific advancement and humanitarian causes. My work would be building on that tradition, not departing from it." Lady Pemberton, another senior advisor, looked uncomfortable as she spoke. "Princess Elena, no one questions your commitment or expertise. But we must consider the broader implications. If you accept this position and then future international decisions conflict with British interests, how do we navigate that complexity while maintaining the Crown's relationship with our government?" The question revealed the sophistication of Victoria's strategy. She had identified genuine complexities that could arise from Elena's international role and used them to build a case for rejection that seemed reasonable and protective rather than simply obstructive. It was a political masterpiece that put Elena in the position of appearing reckless if she pushed back too strongly. Alexander had remained silent during the initial exchanges, but Elena could see his growing frustration with the direction of the conversation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of his position as heir to the throne. "I find it interesting that we're suddenly concerned about international complications when the Crown has successfully navigated similar situations for decades," Alexander said, his gaze moving deliberately around the table. "Prince Philip's involvement with the World Wildlife Fund, Princess Anne's work with international Olympic committees, my own role with veterans organizations, none of these were seen as problematic when they involved meaningful leadership positions." The comparison was devastatingly effective because it exposed the double standard being applied to Elena's situation. The male members of the royal family had regularly taken prominent international roles without facing the kind of institutional resistance Elena was encountering. The implication was clear. The problem wasn't with international involvement itself, but with Elena specifically. Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment before she recovered. "Alexander, those are excellent examples of appropriate royal involvement, but they were built over many years with careful preparation and extensive consultation. Elena's environmental work, while admirable, has developed very quickly. Perhaps a more gradual approach would be wise." The gradual approach argument was Victoria's fallback position, It appeared reasonable, while effectively postponing Elena's opportunities indefinitely. By the time Elena had satisfied whatever criteria Victoria established for readiness, the Environmental Council offer would be long gone, and other opportunities would face similar delays. Elena realized that traditional diplomatic responses weren't going to be sufficient. If she wanted to maintain her ability to do meaningful work, she needed to be more direct about what was actually happening in the room. "Your Majesty, with great respect," Elena said, her voice carrying a new note of determination. "I believe we should acknowledge what this conversation is really about. The question isn't whether I'm qualified for this position. My credentials speak for themselves. The question is whether the royal family is prepared to support a member who approaches these issues with a different style and perspective than what we've seen before." The directness of Elena's response created a moment of tension that forced everyone in the room to confront the underlying dynamics they had been dancing around. Several council members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Elena was calling attention to the personal nature of the resistance she was facing. Victoria's response was swift and calculated. "Elena, dear, I think you may be misunderstanding the nature of our concerns. This isn't about your style or perspective. It's about ensuring that your undoubted talents are channeled in ways that strengthen rather than potentially complicate our constitutional role." But Elena was no longer willing to accept Victoria's careful reframing. "Then, let's discuss specifics," she said calmly. "What exactly about this position would complicate our constitutional role in ways that Prince Philip's international environmental work did not? What specific aspects of leading climate policy discussions would compromise royal neutrality in ways that other family members' international leadership roles have not?" The questions forced Victoria to either provide concrete objections, which would reveal the weakness of her position, or resort to vague concerns that would make her opposition appear arbitrary and personal. It was a moment of strategic confrontation that would determine not just Elena's immediate future, but the broader question of how much independence and influence she would be allowed to have as a member of the royal family. The battle had reached a crucial turning point, and Elena was about to discover whether her decision to fight back directly would strengthen her position or provide Victoria with the ammunition she needed to complete Elena's marginalization. Part for the silence in the council chamber stretched for several heartbeats as Victoria processed Elena's direct challenge. Elena could see her stepmother-in-law calculating her response, weighing the risks of escalating the confrontation against the potential benefits of maintaining her careful facade of concern. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice carried a subtle shift that Elena recognized as dangerous. "Elena, I appreciate your passion, but I think your questions reveal exactly the kind of impulsive thinking that concerns us," Victoria said, her tone remaining superficially gentle while delivering what was clearly intended as a devastating blow. "The fact that you don't immediately see the potential complications suggests that perhaps more seasoned judgment should guide these decisions." The attack was precisely crafted to undermine Elena's credibility by framing her direct questions as evidence of poor judgment rather than legitimate challenges to weak arguments. It was a classic political maneuver. Turn your opponent's strength into an apparent weakness by recontextualizing their behavior. But Alexander had reached his limit. Rising from his seat with the controlled power that came from years of royal training, he addressed the room with unmistakable authority. "I think we need to pause this discussion and acknowledge some uncomfortable truths about what's happening here." The change in Alexander's demeanor was so pronounced that even Victoria looked momentarily uncertain. Elena had seen her husband in many difficult situations, but never with this particular combination of royal authority and personal conviction. He was no longer trying to navigate the situation diplomatically. He was preparing to confront it head-on. "For the past 30 minutes, we've listened to concerns about Elena's qualifications and judgment," Alexander continued, his gaze moving deliberately around the table. "Yet no one has mentioned that she holds advanced degrees in environmental law and international policy, that her Green Crown initiative has already resulted in concrete policy changes in 8 countries, or that she was specifically requested for this position by environmental ministers from 37 nations. Alexander's systematic dismantling of the opposition's case was methodical and devastating. Instead, we've heard vague concerns about complications and suggestions that she needs more seasoned judgment. I find it remarkable that these same concerns never arose when other family members took prominent international roles with far less relevant expertise. Lady Pemberton attempted to interrupt. "Alexander, surely you understand that we're simply trying to protect." "No," Alexander said firmly, his voice cutting through her attempt to redirect the conversation. "What I understand is that my wife is being held to standards that have never been applied to anyone else in this family. And I understand that certain people have decided her influence and popularity represent a threat that needs to be contained." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Several council members looked deeply uncomfortable, recognizing that Alexander was forcing them to choose sides in a conflict they had hoped to avoid. Victoria's expression had hardened, her careful mask of maternal concern finally slipping to reveal something much colder. "Alexander," Victoria said, her voice taking on a warning tone, "I hope you're not suggesting that legitimate institutional concerns are actually personal vendettas. That would be a very serious accusation with significant implications." The threat was barely veiled. Victoria was reminding Alexander that challenging her authority could have consequences for his own position and future reign. It was a moment of raw power politics that revealed just how much influence she had accumulated during her years as queen consort. But Alexander's response surprised everyone in the room, including Elena. Instead of backing down or attempting to defuse the situation, he smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both charming and genuinely menacing. "Actually, Victoria, I think I'm suggesting exactly that," Alexander said calmly. "And I think we should examine the evidence." Elena receives international recognition for her environmental work, and suddenly there are concerns about her overstepping. She successfully engages world leaders in meaningful policy discussions, and it becomes a problem requiring supervision. She's offered the most prestigious environmental position available to any royal, and it's immediately framed as inappropriate and risky. Alexander moved to stand behind Elena's chair, placing his hands on her shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and declarative. The pattern is clear to anyone willing to see it. The question is whether this council will be part of that pattern or whether it will fulfill its actual purpose of supporting family members who are bringing honor and achievement to the crown. The challenge was absolute. Alexander was forcing the council to make a definitive choice: support Elena's acceptance of the Environmental Council position or reveal themselves as participants in Victoria's campaign of undermining. There was no middle ground left. Lord Fairfax cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should consider a compromise position. Elena could accept the role, but with certain protocols in place to ensure appropriate coordination with official foreign policy." "No," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying a new note of finality that surprised everyone. "No more compromises that chip away at the substance while preserving the appearance of support. I either accept this position with the full backing of this family, or I decline it, and we all acknowledge that certain members will always be held to different standards." Elena's ultimatum was as bold as Alexander's challenge, but it came from a different source of power. While Alexander was leveraging his position as heir, Elena was drawing on something more fundamental: the recognition that her own dignity and effectiveness required clear boundaries about what she would and would not accept. "The Environmental Council chose me for this position because of my expertise, my track record, and my commitment to meaningful change," Elena continued. "They didn't choose me to be a ceremonial figurehead or a carefully managed representative of traditional royal approaches to international relations. If that's what this family requires, then we should be honest about it rather than creating elaborate justifications for limiting my effectiveness." Victoria's composure finally cracked entirely. "Elena, you seem to forget that you married into this family, with all the responsibilities and constraints that entails. You cannot simply decide to operate as an independent agent when it suits your personal ambitions. And you seem to forget, Alexander interrupted, his voice cutting through Victoria's words with steel, that Elena didn't marry a position or an institution. She married me, and I will not stand by while anyone, regardless of their title or relationship to this family, systematically undermines my wife's dignity, effectiveness, or contributions. The confrontation had reached a point of no return. Elena realized that whatever happened next would fundamentally reshape the power dynamics within the royal family. The careful balance of influence, the unspoken hierarchies, the traditional deference, all of it was about to change irrevocably. King Edmund's voice, when it finally came, carried the weight of absolute authority that reminded everyone in the room who ultimately held the power to resolve the situation. He had been silent throughout the escalating conflict, but his expression suggested he had heard everything he needed to make a decision. "This discussion ends now," the king said quietly, but his words carried the unmistakable force of royal command. "Elena will accept the Environmental Council position with the full support of this family. Victoria, your concerns have been noted, but they are overruled. Alexander, your defense of your wife is both appropriate and appreciated." The king's decision was final, but Elena could see in Victoria's expression that the war itself was far from over. By publicly overruling his wife in favor of his daughter-in-law, King Edmund had handed Elena a significant victory while simultaneously escalating the personal conflict to a new level. Furthermore, the king continued, "Elena will have full access to diplomatic resources and protocol support for her new role. Any family member who has concerns about her activities may address them to me directly rather than attempting to undermine her work through indirect channels." The warning was clearly directed at Victoria, and everyone in the room understood its implications. The king was not just supporting Elena's position. He was establishing consequences for continued opposition. As the council session concluded, Elena felt a complex mixture of triumph and apprehension. She had won the immediate battle, securing not just the right to accept the Environmental Council position, but also establishing clear boundaries about how she would be treated going forward. But she also recognized that Victoria's ambitions and resentments hadn't disappeared. They had simply been forced underground where they might become even more dangerous. That evening, as Elena and Alexander walked through the palace gardens where their conflict with Victoria had begun, they discussed the implications of their victory and the challenges that lay ahead. "She won't forgive this," Elena said, her voice mixing relief with realistic concern. "Being overruled by your father in front of the entire council. That's not something someone like Victoria will simply accept and move on from." Alexander nodded, his expression serious despite their success. "No, she won't. But what she'll discover is that the rules of engagement have changed. She succeeded for years because she operated in shadows and relied on people's reluctance to confront her directly. Now that everything is in the open, she'll find it much harder to maintain her campaign." Elena hoped Alexander was right, but she also understood that their victory had been costly. The royal family's internal conflicts were now a matter of official record, and the careful facade of unity that had protected them all had been shattered. Whatever came next would require them to build something new, a version of royal duty that could accommodate Elena's authentic voice and meaningful contributions without destroying the institution they had sworn to serve. As they walked among Queen Isabella's roses in the gathering twilight, Elena reflected on how much had changed since that first confrontation at the state dinner. She had discovered reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed, and she had learned that sometimes the most important battles were not fought for victory, but for the right to remain true to yourself while serving something larger than yourself. The crown Elena wore would always be heavier than the one Victoria sought to impose, but it would also be genuinely her own. The future would bring new challenges and conflicts, but they would be faced by a woman who had learned to fight for her values and a marriage that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. In the end, Elena realized that was perhaps the most important victory of all.